This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by democracy at work. So welcome to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, and this is the second part of the consideration that I want to give to a forthcoming book, which I've not read, but I've read accounts of, by Brad DeLong, called Slouching Towards Utopia. In the first session, we looked at one of the sources of technological innovation and technological change, which allowed human populations to escape what's called the Malthusian trap of populations growing up to the point where all populations are basically going to be living at subsistence level and a poverty level. And as Malthus said, that's going to mean poverty for the masses is due to the dynamics of population change relative to the expansion of productivity in agriculture in general, but also in production in general. Now, production in general became very much more productive in two periods in particular, from 1850 to about 1910 and from 1945 to 1975. And during these periods, the world saw the radical growth of a middle class. About the top 10% of the population was one thing. The next 40% was in much better living standard, certainly in the main centers of capitalist development. And this was if you like, a pretty much revolution in the history of humanity. Now, there is, however, a second puzzle which bothered DeLong, and that's the fact that even though wealth was much greater and much better distributed after, say, in this late period of the late 19th century and the period from 1945 to 1975, even though that was the case, this didn't mean that people were happier and that things were going well and everybody felt happy and content and reasonably. In fact, the evidence suggests that the levels of discontent are very high, even though all of the technological gizmos that we need are around us. We can use them. There's been a phenomenal increase in commodity availability, a cornucopia of new products, new living styles, new forms of cuisine, new forms of everything, new forms of spectacle, new forms. Everything is kind of fantastically innovative and fantastically new, and yet somehow or other the indications of discontent are very strong. The mass shootings in this country, where is that coming from? And it's interesting. You see that when it comes to sort of doing something about the mass shootings, Congress looks at the situation, and given the influence of the National Rifle Association, is unable to do very much, but increasingly says these mass shootings are not due to guns, they're due to mental problems, and that therefore we have to address mental problems. So the last piece of legislation went through, which is the first legislation on gun use for the last 30 or 40 years. It had a big wad of money for mental assistance and dealing with gun violence as a mental problem. So then the question arises, well, where is that mental problem coming from? Where in Brad DeLong's account does the discontent come from? The lack of happiness, the lack of content, even on the part of those populations who've never had it so good. Why is it that we're so discontent? Why is it that we have all of these signs around us of this discontent welling up into violence, of the mass shootings in this country? And not only in this country, but elsewhere. Why is it spilling over into all of this political kind of fight and the increasing authoritarianism of governments, the increasing tendency to engage in fascistic control measures, the levels of social control, the militarization of of security, all of those kinds of things. So that we've got a tremendous problem on our hands apparently right now. And if we kind of said, are people in the United States content with the way things are going? The last poll I saw suggested that only 30% were happy and 70% were unhappy with the direction the country was taking. Now, why they were unhappy, well, we don't know exactly, but they are unhappy. And so why is that the case? Now, in reading this, it reminded me very much of Marx commenting on John Stuart Mill. Marx opens the chapter on machinery by kind of saying, John Stuart Mill had a real serious conundrum. His conundrum was this, that we have finally all of this labor-saving machinery, all of this time-saving machinery, and all of it would suggest that the load of labor should be less. But, said Mill, all of the evidence suggests that the load of labor is becoming worse, that the invention of machines is not making life better for the laborer, but it's making it much worse. And then Marx goes on to talk about exactly how and why it makes it much worse. But his response to Mill is this. He said, well, of course it's worse. Of course it is. Because the purpose of all of this innovation was never to lighten the load of labor. The purpose of this innovation was to increase profitability, to increase surplus value, and to increase surplus value by making the wage rate go down because the cost of wage goods was going to go down. And also individual capitalists would get an extra amount of the surplus if they had a superior technology relative to their rivals. So that what Marx is kind of saying is that the main reason for the John Stuart Mill to find that labor does not lighten the load of labor is because it was never designed to do that. And there's an interesting moment I remember when I came across the sort of written memoirs of a very active business person in Paris in the Second Empire. And at some point or other, he was very innovative. He was constantly innovating and he was asked, why is he innovating? And he said, well, it's to get the cost of commodities down, it's to be more efficient. But also, he said, it's to actually undermine the power of the laborer. And then Marx kind of comments about how much technological innovation is about disciplining labor, about disempowering labor and disciplining labor. And if it's about that, then of course, what Brad DeLong is talking about is saying, well, all this technological innovation does not seem to be improving happiness. And I think the Marxist answer would be just along Marx's lines to say, well, it's because the innovation is not designed to create happiness. It's designed a lot of the time to facilitate new wants, needs, and desires, to stimulate desire and all of those kinds of things. It's certainly about doing all of that, but it's not about making the world better for people. And it's not about improving their lives in any way. It's about trying to actually create a world in which more profit is to be had. And that is why it's there. And therefore, it doesn't lead to shortening of the working day. It does not lead to sort of economies of time for the laborer. It means that capital can actually use these innovations to soak up more time from the laborer. And here's the answer of what a production line looks like. And, the Charlie Chaplin movie Modern Times is a wonderful example of exactly how this occurs. That of course, the laborer is not actually going to be treated in a way which is more felicitous and is happier. There's no concern for the laborer being happier. What there's concern for is that the profitability of capital improve. Now, what Marx kind of shows is that individual capitalists operating in their own interest create technological configurations which in the long run are actually going to undermine the rate of profit. So there's this kind of contradiction there, but the central contradiction that I think that we need to deal with is an answer to Brad DeLong is this. Capital and capitalism may be brilliant at creating a cornucopia of new products, of new ideas, of new possibilities, new new consumption patterns and new lifestyles and all the rest of it. It is fantastic at doing that. But it's also and not only producing all of those new commodities and all of the possibilities of real improvement of wealth, what capital also produces is alienation. Now put that together. In other words, there you have the contradiction, the central contradiction of what capital is about. This is what Marx is identifying, that there is this contradiction between capital as a dynamic, creative force. At the same time, it's creating alienation and increasing alienation, so that the increase of productivity is associated with an increase in alienation and alienating behavior. Now, alienated behavior doesn't end up just being, anti-capitalist. It tends to be anti-anything, and easily susceptible to all sorts of kind of crazy ideas that it's, the problems of society are due to too much immigration, too little, too much attention being paid to minorities, too much attention being paid to women, or whatever. Anything can come up there as a form. But the fundamental contradiction is this: between capital as a productive and constructive force in terms of increasing the productivity of labor, but doing it in a way which is kind of increasingly oriented towards the maximization of profit, versus capital, which is increasingly alienating and is creating alienated labor. And Marx in the Grundrisse is very explicit about this when he kind of says, actually, capital at its heart contains the conflict between alienated capital, that is, capital which is not in charge of its own destiny, but it has to engage and abide by the laws of motion of capital, by the laws of the market. The coercive laws of competition force capital to employ labor harder and harder and harder. And therefore the capitalist is alienated, and of course the laborer is alienated because their creative capacities and powers are taken over by another, and those creative capacities and powers are made turned into something which is making something which maybe you don't care about. I mean, do you really want to make munitions to go and blow people up in Ukraine? Or is that what you want to do? The answer is no, but it's a job, and I have to do it. And do I really want to do a job where I'm, alienated in the sense that I'm screwing people in terms of opioid addiction and all the rest of it? Is that what I want to do? The answer is no. Well, that's the only way I can make money. Therefore, I have to do it. So Marx says, quite simply, that capital rests upon alienated capital, alienated labor, encountering each other, and working in relation in such a way as to maximize the laws of motion of capital, which are independently established of anybody's wants, needs, and desires. Remember, the definition of a market in Adam Smith is a market is one in which prices cannot be determined by any one individual. Prices can only be arrived at through buying and selling in the market. And that is therefore an alien situation, in that I have spent a lot of time on a particular product, but I only get in the market what its value is, which is what the average social average of its productivity would be. So this is something which is central to Marx. Now, I've mentioned this before, and I want to come back to it. And I'm going to actually do what I thought I would not do, which is read something, which is an article I wrote last year, which is about the double consciousness of capital. And this is an article drawn from the Grundrisse, and I published it in the Socialist Register. And I thought it was a very important article in lots of ways, and that's why I'm partly going to take the liberty of repeating to you some of its arguments today. Interestingly, the only place in the world where it has stirred up some controversy and some interest has been in China. I've had at least a dozen invitations to translate the article and circulate it in Chinese. I accepted the first two, and then since then I said, well, it's been translated a couple of other places, so please don't do it again. But it seems that, people writing to me say this is a very interesting argument. It's one we need to take account of and we need to think about. And therefore, we thank you for drawing it to our attention. And what I draw to your attention is two passages from the Grundrisse, which really seem to contradict each other, but my argument is that they actually are integral to each other. And the first argument is this, and I read from the Grundrisse: capital creates the bourgeois society and the universal appropriation of nature, as well as the social bond itself by the members of society. Hence, the great civilizing influence of capital is production of a stage of society in comparison to which all earlier ones appear as mere local developments of humanity and as nature idolatry. For the first time, nature becomes purely an object for humankind, purely a matter of utility, ceases to be recognized as a power for itself, and the theoretical discovery of its autonomous laws appears merely as a ruse, so as to subjugate it under human needs, whether as an object of consumption or as a means of production. In accord with this tendency, capital drives beyond national barriers and prejudices, as much as beyond nature worship, as well as all traditional, confined, complacent, encrusted satisfaction of present needs, and reproductions of old ways of life. It is destructive towards all this, and constantly revolutionizes it, tearing down all the barriers which hem in the development of the forces of production, the suspension of needs, the all-sided development of production, and the exploitation and exchange of natural and mental forces. Now, this is obviously a very positive account of the creative powers of capital, to submission of nature to human will, the development of all-sided development of production and exploitation and exchange of natural and mental forces. It's an incredible kind of vision of a future society based upon that. But then, later in the text, a few pages later, Marx says this: the old view, in which the human being appears as the aim of production, regardless of his limited national, religious, political character, seems to be very lofty when contrasted to the modern world, where production appears as the aim of mankind and wealth as the aim of production. In fact, however, when the limited bourgeois form is stripped away, what is wealth, other than the universality of individual needs, capacities, pleasures, productive forces, etc., created through universal exchange? The full development of human mastery over the forces of nature, those of so-called nature, as well as humanity's own nature. The absolute working out of his creative potentialities, with no presupposition other than the previous historic development, which makes this totality of development, i.e. the development of all human powers, as such the end in itself, not as measured on a predetermined yardstick, where he does not reproduce himself in one specificity within the division of labor, but produces his totality, strives not to remain something he has become, but is in the absolute movement of becoming. This is the positive side, which we've already encountered. So then he continues. In the epoch of production, in bourgeois economics, and in the epoch of production to which it corresponds, this complete working out of the human content, which is the positive side, appears as a complete emptying out. This universal objectification as total alienation, and the tearing down of all limited one-sided aims as sacrifice of the human end in itself to an entirely external end. This is why the childish world of antiquity appears on one side as loftier. On the other side, it really is loftier, in all matters where closed shapes, forms, and given limits are sought for. It is satisfaction, from a limited standpoint, while the modern gives no satisfaction, or where it appears satisfied with itself, it is vulgar. So you go from the idea that the history of capital combines these two features, which is the possibility of creating a new form of civilization built around the new technologies, built around the possibility of human emancipation to become whoever we want, however we want, given the new technologies and possibilities. But against that, we have this total toxic side, the toxicity of all of this. Satisfaction from a limited standpoint, satisfied with itself, it is vulgar. Objectification as total alienation, the tearing down of all limited one-sided aims and sacrifice of the human end in itself to an entirely external end. The wealth of the bourgeoisie is what we are built to do, and it is therefore totally alienated. Now, in that kind of sense, the point of a class society is to say that one part of the society will be able to benefit from all of these. This is the top 10%, or nowadays we might say even the top 50%. The bottom 50% is locked into a meaningless world where its labor is simply used by capital, not for the benefit of humanity, but for the benefit of capital, for the benefit of creating more wealth, more power to the capitalist class. And what we see here is Marx kind of saying, this is a double consciousness. On the one hand, you can't walk away from all that capital has created. It has created a set of possibilities, real possibilities for humanity. But at the same time, it has done it in such a way, but that by redirecting those possibilities to simply the creation of product, the creation of surplus value, which is going to be appropriated by capital and the capitalist class, more and more centralized, of course, more and more in the billionaire class, with a very substantial 40% middle class, which is benefiting to some degree from it all. But is there any wonder that there is a deep discontent with the nature of this society? I think what Marx is saying is the emancipated laborer will want to abolish not the processes of technological change, not the processes of interchange in a global market. We don't want to withdraw from all of that. We don't want to go back from all of that. But what we want to do is we want to mobilize it for the benefit of all. And in other words, the decision as to whether this technology is a good piece of technology shall be based upon its capacity and its use. In other words, the kind of technology which actually it can be used by capital to simply consolidate its centralization and its power is not the kind of technology we need. The kind of technology which allows a better missile to be created by this country as opposed to that country so that you could lob missiles at each other, destroying each other, that is not what we want to do. In other words, Marx is kind of suggesting that in a class-bound society, what we have to do is to recognize the distributive consequences of that class and to recognize what it is that capital seeks in terms of its technological change. Some of that technological change obviously has dual uses. It can be used to protect people, it can be used to help people, and we find a positive use for it, and some of it has a negative use. Our problem is that capital inevitably produces products, capacities, and powers which are both sorts. They can be used for good, they can be used for bad. They are, in a sense, neutral. But some of them are not neutral. Missiles are not neutral. They're about killing machines. And the whole killing machine of the military is not useful. The whole killing machine of the world is not useful. And also, the fact that nobody can take meaning from their work. There was a kind of a Pew poll at one point or other where it was asking about content with the work, and about 1/3 of the population said they hated their work. Another third said they were indifferent, and only about a third actually got any satisfaction from their work. Well, with 2/3 of the population either indifferent or antagonistic to the work they're doing, how can people find any satisfaction in laboring for capital? The answer is that most of the working class are in those 2/3, and therefore they are very much about loss of meaning, loss of independence, loss of autonomy, loss of creativity. And what do people do? Well, one of the ways in which you can be recognized is to go out and shoot somebody. So what we start to see is actually one of these things. Where is the mental illness coming from? The mental illness, what we'd submit, has much to do with the nature of what capital is about. And it is the alienation of capital and the alienation of labor and the collision of those two in a class-bound society, which is at the root of a lot of the problems. In other words, you can end up with all kinds of consultants and all kinds of, counselors and all this kind of thing, trying to deal with this alienation. But the source of the alienation is constantly there. All the counselors can do is to try to teach you to cope with the alienation and to cope in a way which is not violent. But what we're seeing is that coping mechanism is no longer in place, no longer restrained. It's going into politics. It's going into hate campaigns against minorities, against immigrants, against everybody, and we're increasingly seeing violence constructed by alienated populations. Because as I started out by saying, alienation doesn't mean that you're going to be antagonistic to the kinds of politics which are coming out of what the capitalist class is about. You may actually be a sucker for that politics. And that sucker can be that you will be drawn into violence and the like. And I would like to suggest that this dilemma that Brad DeLong finds problematic has its roots in the nature of alienation and contemporary society. He would hate that argument, obviously, kind of say, well, it's Marxist rubbish, and probably say a few other things about it's not even good intellectual masturbation, which at least can make you feel good, because it doesn't make you feel good. And I'm very glad if it does not make you feel good, because something has to be done about the root causes of the alienation which exists in our society today. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.